Hi, and welcome to CITAM Church Online. My name is Patrick Kuchio, the head of missions at Christ is the Answer Ministries, and this is the Youth Cafe. What is it with humanity that we tend to forget the things we should not quite be forgetting? And we tend to remember things we should not be remembering. This is a terrible blight that most of us human beings suffer from. So join me in this discussion, in this conversation that I've titled, Forget Not. Forget Not. The psalmist in Psalm 103, verse 1 and 2 following says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not his benefits." The psalmist, at some critical point in history, calls upon us to tackle this terrible blight that affects most of us human beings. Forgetting what we should not be forgetting, and remembering what we should not be remembering. Now, left on our own, human beings can be some of the most forgetful lot of people. In fact, the study of the nation of Israel in the scriptures is a study of a forgetful lot of people. But you wonder, is it just about the Israelites? It is not about the Israelites alone. So allow me to share with you a story I had about these three widows, elderly widows who lived together. One evening, one of the widows decided to retire to bed, and as she was going up the staircase, she got midway and forgot where she was headed. So she calls to one of the widows downstairs and asks, "Hi, please remind me, where was I going?" One of the elderly widows in agitation answers, "Hey, you are going to bed, go to bed." And she proceeded to bed. Shortly later, one of the other elderly widows decides to go to fix herself a cup of tea in the kitchen before she retires to bed. And as she got to the kitchen, she forgot what had taken her to the kitchen. Some of you can identify with this. You may not be old or young, or it's not a function of age. But this elderly widow calls out to the other widow who was in the living room, "Please remind me, what had I come to do in the kitchen?" This other widow, agitated again, says, "You are going to fix yourself a cup of tea before you go to bed." Now, the widow who was left in the living room accidentally hit the dining table and produced a sound like one was knocking. And she quickly got up and went to the door, thinking someone was at the door, only to realize she had forgotten it's her who had just knocked the dining table. And she goes to the door and goes like, "Who is it? Who is it?" And there was no one. She had forgotten that she's the one who had hit the dining table. We all suffer from forgetfulness, and it is not a function of age or status. It is just a condition of humanity. Little wonder the psalmist calls upon us not to forget his benefits, the Lord's benefits. "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not his benefits." Who forgives you your sins, who heals you your diseases, who restores our youth, so that our youth is renewed like the eagles. The psalmist lists a couple of things that you and I should not forget, but then he reminds us of some things we should not be remembering. And says, "As far as the east is from the west, so has he removed your sins and your transgressions from you." Do you catch yourself rehearsing, remembering things that belong to the past? Do you find yourself forgetting the things that you should be remembering? Now, the book of Deuteronomy is a very interesting book. 28 chapters of the Bible dedicated to reminding the children of Israel God's faithfulness. Because the children of Israel, this is around 1400 BC. They had left Egypt around 1440 BC. And they had wandered in the wilderness for a cool 40 years. Why? Because of their rebellion. They were not willing to step into God's promised land. And God allows them to go round and round and round and round and round. Now they gather at the plains of the Jordan, on the plains of the Moab, and Moses is preparing them to enter the promised land. Remember, at this point in time, Moses knows very well that God has forbidden him to enter the promised land. So he gathers the nation of Israel and he begins to prepare them. The book of Deuteronomy itself means repetition of the law. So Moses gathers the children of Israel and he begins to repeat over and over again some fundamental truths that God had shared with the children of Israel. For instance, the 10 Commandments that had been given on the foot of Mount Sinai. The guys who had gathered here in the book of Deuteronomy on the plains of Moab, the plains of the Jordan, this is the east of the Jordan, some of them had never quite experienced what had happened on Mount Sinai, because this was a new generation. And Moses sets out to prepare them for new leadership. He sets to prepare them for new enemies, for new experience in Canaan. And he goes through the book of Deuteronomy from the beginning to the end. It's been observed that this was one speech. This was a speech given in one setting. I wonder how long it took. It probably must have taken a long time. But in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses begins to tackle this blight of forgetfulness. And allow me just to show you there's 3 things that Moses would share with us that will help us not to be a forgetful lot of people. The first thing that Moses would point us to is remember the Lord your God. Now, the book of Deuteronomy reveals Moses' character. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses talks from his heart. He just relates and recounts what God had said to the children of Israel. And the first pronounced truth that you find in the book of Deuteronomy is this call to remember the Lord your God. Would you believe that about 300 times in the book of Deuteronomy, from chapter 1 to chapter 28, Moses calls upon the children of Israel to remember the Lord their God. Now, this is a prescription for this disease called forgetfulness. Remembering the Lord your God. At some point, Moses tells the children of Israel, it is not because that you are special, that's why God invited you into a covenant relationship. Absolutely not. God of his own grace, God of his own mercy, chose you, Israelites, to be his special covenant people. But you have forgotten him all this period of time. And it says, remember the Lord your God. The minute you catch yourself forgetting, the minute you catch yourself imagining that the wealth you have is hard-earned, the status you have in society is hard-earned, the family you have, the possessions you own are hard-earned, that is a minute to stop and remember the Lord your God. Moses warns the children of Israel that when you get to the promised land, do not forget the Lord your God. Don't get to a place you imagine that out of our strength, out of our ability, out of our sheer hard work, we have what we have. Because this is a reality. The children of Israel were preparing to occupy territory they had not worked for. They were preparing to own homes they had not built. They were preparing to own vineyards they had not cultivated. And Moses calls upon them to remember the Lord their God. What was Moses saying? He was reminding the children of Israel that they were not a biological accident, that they had a God who was responsible for where they were. They had a God who was responsible for what they had. They had a God who was responsible for who they were. So allow me to remind you as well, not to be a forgetful person, not to be a forgetful lot of people, by remembering the Lord our God. None of us is a biological accident. We didn't just happen. We are not the product of a moment of pleasure between our parents. Absolutely not. God carefully designed that you and I will be where we are today. So remember the Lord your God. It is unfortunate the way we easily forget, particularly when we begin to acquire status in life, possessions, position, and power. We forget that we are a product of our relationship with God. Now, you may not even be in an intimate relationship with God. The fact remains, you are who you are today, not because of a Big Bang theory, but because God carefully designed you. So remember the Lord your God. This is one thing that Moses is pleading the children of Israel. He is now 120 years old. So Grandfather Moses would speak to you and would speak to me today and say, remember the Lord your God. If you're to walk through life a grateful person, you must remember the Lord your God. But secondly, reflect on your journey. Reflect on your journey. The book of Deuteronomy is a historical book. It captures the events of the nation of Israel, right from their release from Egypt in 1440 BC to the threshold of entering Canaan, 1400 BC. 40 years. And it covers the journey that they took, the meanderings, the experiences, the hardships, the starvation, when they didn't have meat, when they didn't have water, when they felt scared, when snakes were unleashed on them. It's a historical book. It captures history. And if you and I are going to go through life being grateful people, we must reflect on our history. You must reflect on your history. I have a history. God has taken us through history, and that history is very rich. The family you were born to, the schools you went to, the accidents he brought you through, the sicknesses he's healed you from, the provision that is brought your way. You have a lot of history. If you were to sit down and just reflect on your history, there is so much to thank God for. Little wonder the psalmist would say, bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not his benefits. David had a history. He had a history growing up in Bethlehem. As a shepherd boy, he had a history where he had been forgotten and had been shoved to the backside of the desert to care for lambs. He had a history on how God brought him from the back of beyond and anointed him to be king. He had a history. By the time he writes and says, bless the Lord, all my soul, and forget not his benefits, he was remembering the history. He was reflecting on history. So I call upon you, whether young or old, reflect on the history. And as you reflect on that history, remember, history is about his story. His story. History. His story. You cannot talk about history without talking about him, because history is about his story, God's story, of what he's taken you through, what he has saved you from, and what he has saved you through. So reflect on your history. Moses calls upon the children of Israel to reflect on history, the history that God had taken them through. But finally, how do you and I deal with this terrible disease called forgetfulness? Relying on God to carry us through. You see, Moses had relied on his own strength. At the waters of Meribah, God spoke to Moses and told him, speak to the rock, and out of the rock water shall flow. What did Moses do? Moses took his rod and he hit the rock. You see, that rod that Moses had done amazing miracles. The same rod had parted the Red Seas. At one point, that same rod had provided water for the children of Israel, an entire nation, about 1.2 million people, just one rod. But on this particular occasion, God speaks to Moses and tells him, speak to the rock. Moses hit the rock. A clear indication that he was not relying on God's instruction. If you and I are going to go through life a grateful lot of people, not a forgetful lot of people, we must rely on God to carry us through. Now you see, Deuteronomy is a repetition of law. Deuteronomy means repetition of law. Moses spends this long period of time reminding the children of Israel of God's laws, reminding them that when you go into the promised land, you are likely to forget the Lord your God. You are likely to forget his instructions. You are likely to begin to worship other gods. You are likely to attribute your wealth, your success to other gods. But do not do so. Rely on the Lord your God. Moses had failed on this one account. When he failed to rely on God's instruction, it cost him entrance to the promised land. So he pleads with the children of Israel, and he pleads with you and with me today, saying, rely on God. Rely on God. You see, Joshua was about to take over from Moses. And Joshua's leadership style was completely different from that of Moses. They were about to face new enemies in this land. They were about to walk into new experiences. And the way to remain level-headed was to rely on God. I know you're up against all manner of foes. You're up against all manner of experiences. But if you and I are not going to scamper away, if you and I are not going to run away from whatever experiences, either positive or negative, if you and I are going to face whatever challenges, whatever giants that wait for us in the land, we must rely on God. And when you follow through the book of Deuteronomy to the book of Joshua, you realize that when Joshua took over, he relied on God. The moments he failed to rely on God, he was beaten up. The children of Israel were beaten. They were beaten at battle. But every time they relied on God, victory was guaranteed. So I came to remind us that this blight called forgetfulness can be tackled. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not his benefits. I call upon you. Do not keep rehearsing the things that belong in the past, your failures, your sins, your mistakes. Those belong to the past, but continue rehearsing God's faithfulness, his goodness, his kindness, his mercies to you. That will help you tackle this blight called forgetfulness, and you will be prepared to deal with any challenge that God is taking you into in this new land. So what are you preparing for? What are you facing? I came to remind you, remember the Lord your God. Reflect on your history, remembering that history cannot be history without God in the midst of it. But rely on the Lord your God to carry you through. And you will go through life a grateful person, because God is waiting on you and I to shed this blight, to shed this disease called forgetfulness, and embrace gratefulness. Let's keep this conversation going on our social media platforms. Please engage with us on Facebook, on Instagram, on our YouTube channel, on Twitter. Let's keep this discussion going on Forget Not My name is Patrick Kuchio, the head of missions at Christ is the Answer Ministries. The Lord bless you richly.